So what I want to talk about is software bill of material in the telco industry, and sort of what are the current best practices, what are the challenges we're facing, and how can we move forward with that as an industry. And since we're relatively few people here, feel free to bombard in with questions or bright ideas as we talk. I think that will make it more interactive and probably nice. So since we're so few people, anyone familiar? Do everyone know what a software bill of material is? You're all familiar, good. Otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. But that makes my next slide perhaps a little bit redundant in terms of explaining that an SBOM, it's just like your list of ingredients that you have. So my question is, as an industry, how do we move from that there? Like the handwritten notes of go to the grocery store, get me these things. You don't have any measurements, you don't have any sort of further instructions, you don't have which brand of these things should I buy, it's just a list of ingredients, right? How do we get from that to here? Sort of a standardized format of, it's a standard format, it's a standard data field, it's a standard language for how we describe what's in the software we are consuming, right? How do we get to there? And to share some sort of experiences that I've had with suppliers and others in the industry. And I want to make the caveat, it's not all the same supplier, but for the sake of argument, let's just say it is. So this doesn't happen as often anymore, but it's stage one with the suppliers used to be at least so what is even an SBOM? What is this thing you're asking me for? Is it a particularly smelly Swedish cheese, or I don't know what's an SBOM, right? And sort of once you explain to them, well, it's the software inventory of what open source components and commercial components are part of the product I'm buying from you. I need to know that, down to the version. They would be, no, that's proprietary confidential information. I'm not willing to share that with you. And it's we can treat it as confidential information between the two of us, but I really need to know what's in your software if I'm going to do any sort of security or any sort of license compliance. I really need to know the content here, right? So once you sort of gotten out of that, it's sort of, okay, you get an SBOM, kind of, but you would sort of get it in a non-standard format. I think the funniest I got was someone had printed out an Excel sheet with the software they had, and then they had scanned it and sent it to me as a PDF. It's completely unactionable. It's non-machine readable, and it's just a hassle to translate it. And it was a non-standard format of the data as well, where we got someone had basically reinvented SPDX or Cyclone DX, which are the standard formats. And it's sure, your format might be great, but I can't parse this. There's no tooling to be able to parse your specific format that you have invented. I'm sure it's great, but it's not standardized. So stage three, it's we're slightly closer, right? We are talking then about standard formats. We are talking about what sort of data fields to use in that format. Is this data that we're getting, is it machine readable? Yes, it should be. Okay, what's the file format of that? Is it a JSON file? Is it a tag value file? Is it a text file? Excel file? How do we deal with these things? And even, is the right data fields used? Because in for example, in SPDX, we wouldn't care about all the data. No one is really interested in all of the data, nor is anyone really interested in populating all of that data. So it's the right fields. We need certain fields. And that's where sort of and also, how is the SBOM delivered? Is it delivered with the product? Is it delivered via web page? Is it delivered in paper sheets? How do we do that? How do we standardize that? And ensuring that we get it no later than at the delivery of the product. I mean, it's great if someone wants to give it to me before then, because then I can start working on it. But ultimately, we need it at least at sort of the time when we're to get it. So why are SBOMs so hard? Why do we have to have these conversations with our suppliers and our customers, educating them about these things? Well, the industry is not mature. I think we can all agree on that. We will be forced to become mature rather quickly. I mean, in the United States, we have the executive order and the NTIA minimum elements of an SBOM. In Europe, we'll soon have the Cyber Resiliency Act that will mandate SBOMs as well. We have competing standards. That's not necessarily a problem as long as we can harmonize or translate between these standards. Currently, translating between the two dominant standards, SPDX and Cyclone DX, it's hard. You lose some fidelity. Not all fields are translatable. So having a sort of a standard in the industry would be helpful to say, let's align around this one and say, this is what we're going to be asking for. We're going to be asking for SPDX, or we're going to be asking for Cyclone DX, or we're going to be asking for SWID. Not that anyone is using that, but hypothetically, like if we align on that, we would be saving a lot of overhead. And if we, I'll get to that. And sort of for me at least, the standards that exist, they're not sufficient for what we're trying to do. It's like, it's great, we have harmonized on what language we're talking to each other, but I want to understand also what are the data fields that are relevant, right? I want to understand that I'm asking for and getting the same data fields filled from my suppliers that my customers ultimately will be asking me for. And I want to avoid that I'm asking for one thing, my competitors are asking for another thing, because that just creates confusion in the industry and it creates unnecessary overhead for everyone. Just aligning on SPDX, that's great. If we can align on which data fields in SPDX, that's even better. There is no consensus in our industry as what is the use case of the SBOM. Primarily, is it used for security or is it used for open source license compliance? I think we don't have a consensus in the industry of this. I think we need to use it for both, and we need to realize that we can't satisfy both criteria at once, right? We all need the same information. And I'll have an example of why this is problematic a little later in the presentation. And yeah, here. So the consensus on requirements in the SBOM, that's part of the problem here. The NTIA minimum requirements, they don't have a requirement that you need to state the open source license of the component. While that is very basic information, you need to be able to do license compliance. It's completely irrelevant for security. So they didn't bring that in. And another problem we, I guess, have to solve together is, can we trust the SBOMs we get? How do we verify them? Can we come to sort of some standard methodology to do that? Perhaps not a standard implementation for how to do it, but a standard methodology that is sort of understood and accepted by everyone in the supply chain. So my suppliers understand that this is how they will verify my SBOM. This is sort of what I will work towards ensuring that it's correct. And likewise, my customers will be verifying it in the same way. So that we have aligned on that. And it's not that we should optimize for these tests, it's just that the tool you're using or the methodology you're using, it's going to grant you different results. And granted, no SBOM, if it's of any sort of complexity, will ever be 100% perfect. So we also need to align on like what's an acceptable level here. Is 90% okay? Is 95, 99, 99.999? We need to figure out what's an acceptable level, because there will be errors in this. And it's not helping anyone if we start sort of litigating over that, or if we start sort of enforcing it. No, it needs to be 100% perfect. That's not going to help anyone. It's ultimately, it's not going to make license compliance better. It's not going to make security better. There's other things we can do that would have a higher effect on both of these things. So we need to understand as an industry, like, can we trust the SBOM? Yes, but how much and what is sort of an acceptable level of margin of error in these things? So what does the market look like today? Now everyone here seems to be relatively familiar with the topic, but in terms of formats, we have SPDX. That's a ISO standard. It's recently been, and I think it's SPDX 2.1 that or if it's 2.3 that we're standardized in ISO. Then Cyclone DX, it's not an ISO standard, but it has traction in certain industries. For telco, my impression at least is that SPDX is sort of the dominant. If you were to go talk to, for example, Siemens, the healthcare company, they would tell you, no, it's Cyclone DX, that's what works in our industry. So I think these things are somewhat industry specific, and it's driven by the industry requirements. So far, I have not seen any sort of telco specific industry requirement that cannot be met by SPDX, but I'm happy to be proven wrong, right? SPDX is also now out in version 3.0, which is interesting because that finally supports profiles, which might be really useful for our industry if we say, hey, let's have a telco profile or an ORAN profile for these things. We have some standards on minimum information that should be present in these data formats. So most prominent and oldest is the NTIA requirements, the minimum elements. ORAN, working group 11, the security working group, have also requirements on the SBOM and what information should be available there. And that sort of mirrors the NTIA requirements. That's problematic for a few reasons that we could get to later. And as I said, the EU Cyber Resiliency Act will put requirements on SBOMs. We're not 100% sure what they will be, since that legislation is not final, and the harmonized standards that are supposed to support that are not finalized either. Technically, I don't think the standardization request has been sent, but the work has started. And then we have in OpenChain, which is a group I'm very involved in. It's a Linux Foundation project that has the standard for license compliance or open source license compliance and open source security management, two ISO standards. That we also have a telco working group where we have been discussing this exact problem for 2-3 years now, and like, okay, can we all just harmonize and baseline on this is what we want to do, this is the information we need at the bare minimum, this is why we need it, this is like the test case for how it will be satisfied. And we're now at a release 1.0 of that document, and we're looking to sort of update and iterate over time on that, but the guide has now been released, so please feel free to check in on that. We have monthly meetings in that group as well. They're open for everyone, and it's really not just about like a very telco specific thing. It's also about like what's a quality SBOM overall, right? Because as much as we would like to think so, the telco industry isn't that different from anyone else. There's not that many special requirements. So really, there's some like best practices for SBOMs overall. And ultimately, none of these things are entirely aligned in the telco industry today. If I talk to my different customers, different CSPs, they will have slightly different ideas on how they want me to do this. And if you're sort of upstream from me as a supplier, if you talk to us, Nokia or Huawei, they will have slightly different ideas of what do they want you to supply, right? And the problem with that is that that's of course fine if we consider everything as one step, but it's not, because if I have requirements and then my customers have different requirements, someone needs to add this data, someone needs to curate that. And that is driving cost like all along the chain instead of having it done once and having it done correctly. Ultimately to the benefit of everyone. I think we might be so that no one is truly super happy with the result of what a telco SBOM should be, but everyone is at least satisfied that everyone is getting the same thing and everyone is asking the same thing. Maybe I didn't get my pet peeve or my special thing that I wanted in here, but at least now everyone is asking for the same thing, and ultimately that is reducing cost, because an SBOM is never going to be a competitive advantage. It's just boring plumbing that we need to do, ultimately. Yeah, and as I said, like, so how do we solve this? And as been alluded to, there's efforts in OpenChain to be able to do that. And there's also sort of what I would really dream and wish for is, give me a boring ISO number to give to my sourcing department for them to say, dear supplier, fulfill this ISO standard, right? Or GSMA standard, or OASIS or IETF. I don't really care where we standardize this. I'm open to suggestions on that, whatever fits. ISO is good because sourcing departments and salespeople talk ISO. They understand that. If we talk IETF, maybe not so much. But still, it would be formalized somewhere and would have some authority, which is good. So ultimately, making sure that we're all asking for the same thing to not create divergence in the industry, I think that would be a good thing. And we will have to deal with SBOMs sooner rather than later due to legislation, especially if you're in the US. and you have the federal government in any form as a customer, you already have to deal with this. And if you want to be on the European market 24, 36 months from now, then you will also have to deal with this. So here is the GitHub that we're working on for the OpenChain Telco SBOM guide or specification. And it's available in French, Japanese, and English. We had some very good volunteers who helped us translate that. And ultimately, it's please go in, please read it, raise an issue or raise a ticket if you feel that something here could be improved. It's stable in version 1.0, but it's room for improvements. I think everyone is aware of that, but I think it's important that we start aligning on these things. And the broader we can do that, with the more participants to buy into this, the better. There's also this gray thing here that's from the ORAN specification, and that's the test case for the SBOM. There's a problem in this one because it's based on NTIA. And NTIA doesn't mandate all the mandatory fields in SPDX to be used, meaning that you can pass this test case, but you will not have a valid SPDX file. And your tool will reject it, but you have a valid test case, you have passed the test case. So that will be updated. I'm working on a contribution to ORAN to do that. But at least this is an early attempt, right, of like harmonizing that, at least in this area. This is what we considered good, this is the information we need, and this is how we get there, right, with efforts like these. So every small effort will push us a little bit further there. I have a final thing here on like remaining challenges, and it's the changing regulatory landscape, the lack of industry maturity. The industry will have to grow up, and will have to grow up fast, so hopefully we can solve that. But if you're thinking about recruiting someone to work with SBOMs, you're probably better off doing it now, because 12 months from now, I think they're going to be more expensive because there's going to be much bigger demand in the market for people with those skills. The quality of the SBOM, that's a problem. Like, can we trust the data that's in here, and what's an acceptable level for us? Remembering that 100%, if it's a software of any complexity, is probably not going to be feasible. AI-generated code. How will we deal with that? Snippets, for example, that's going to pose entirely new challenges for us in terms of SBOMs. Will we, for example, that's part of the changing legal landscape, but say, for example, that some AI-generated code have taken a snippet from something, inserted it into your code, but it has changed it, so it's like it's only 80% similar. Do you have to declare that? What's the thinking? I don't know. We'll have to figure it out over time, I guess. But it's a remaining challenge. And it's agreeing that license compliance focus versus security focus, it's not an either or, it needs to be a both solution, because we can't have one license compliance SBOM and a security SBOM. That's not really good for anyone, especially when we, with existing solutions, actually can do both. We have divergent upstream and downstream requirements today, because of course everyone wants a lot more information than what they want to give, right? I want this to be easy for me to satisfy, but I want my suppliers to give me everything. I think we need to come to the conclusion that some will have to give more, but in return that's exactly what they will get as well. And sort of the burden will be shared more equally in the ecosystem. I think that's only a fair thing, that we equally split this. What's good enough? We covered that already. And how should we enforce this? Should we enforce these things? Should there be standard test cases for these things? Should there be some sort of standard template clauses one could use to ensure that sort of we're actually asking for the same thing? Or are we going too far then? Should that be left up to implementation and so forth? So that's my talk. I'm very interested in if there's questions, if there's thoughts. Am I barking up the wrong tree with this? Or should we move ahead and sort of focus some energy on this as an industry to try to solve it? What's the feeling in the room? We have a few minutes, I think.
So I can give you my perspective. Within Elephant ONET project, we went through this debate, and we said, okay, we all agree we're going to do it. We stuck to SPDX. We got a couple of pluses because this SPDX, string generator.
Yeah.
So we thought, okay, why don't we use the SPDX2 by just rolling the ball? We used it, we put it in our CI/CD pipeline.
Mm.
So every project that releases, we have signed SBOM, signed software, signed SBOM. So that trust aspect is there. One thing I would say that in the standards, the NTIA minimum requirement, that flexibility they provided initially, which says, if you don't have the information, say no insertion, and that leaves a null field in it, right? That may not be acceptable, but it depends on the consumer,
Yeah.
you know, how stickler they are about it.
I mean, we will have known unknowns, but I think it's important to point out when they are, we know that we don't know this, right?
But I think it's, the challenge that I see is that how do you improve the trust in SBOM? The new human is involved, your CI/CD pipeline to produce SBOM. Because you don't want, you know, like Ericsson gives you software and somebody writes up the spreadsheet and then changes it into SPDX format. That's not what we want, right? I think for people who are makers, software developers, or solution offering entities, they need to create the hooks and the CI/CD pipeline, so human is not, it's for their own internal security, it's not the consumer security. I believe it's for the developer organization security that we use different components for our final product. But we want to make sure that our pipeline understand and recognize when components are coming in, using license, TPL, whatever, we should be doing it for ourselves. And if we do it for ourselves, then it's available for others. I think it's a different mindset. A lot of people think that NTIA or the Cyber Resiliency Act, somebody's demanding it. I think we should do it for ourselves, right? It should be a part of your company's quality initiative. That we can do this, and then it solves the problem, there's a demand for it. Otherwise, if we follow the demand, we miss the aspect of internal quality.
I think that's relatively few that will go that route. I think most people will have a rude awakening so that they have to do it instead. But I think you're absolutely right. There's the point of an SBOM is ultimately not to meet legislative requirements. There's other quality reasons for having that. And it's great that ONAP has it, but ONAP is, relatively speaking, a well-resourced project. So how do we deal with all these like tiny, small projects? Is that something there should be an effort to contribute to, and how do we trust that? What are the test cases? Again, it's the issue and question of trust.
Yeah, so I think we should kind of look around within the open source community. If somebody have cracked that nut, can we take the lesson learned? And right now, it's not the PTLs who are producing right. So LFIT helped design the pipeline and the code and the insertion. So once it's set, it's done. I think where the PTL and communities need to figure out how my workflow is in the CI, with unit code to final delivery. What are the steps, and when do I want to generate? What tool I want to know, so that there is no human insertion, right? You should be collecting that data when the unit code comes in, when you integrate, now you know all the dependencies, you list them, then it's possible. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of no insertion. And you won't be able to create that the parent-child relationship that SPDX and these formats allow. I think that's kind of the key components. A lot of vulnerabilities that we see that get inserted is we don't have visibility to, when you give me a unit, it's made of A and B. I don't know what's in the B. You just showed me A and B is included, but the B itself could have child components with dependencies outdated or they have vulnerabilities. I think that's kind of why we need to do automation and self-generation in the project. And if you're part of LFM, talk to LFIT, because they've done it for Open Daylight, they've done it for ONAP. I think there are a couple other projects that we're interested in. I'm not sure what the implementation level is. But you can take that collateral into those fields without human intervention, that would be a challenge for a lot of companies.
Anyone else who wants to chime in? Yes, sir.
So I have to work with both open source and commercial product. Knowing license compliance and security compliance is a must. I have a tool that's doing it already, right? The SBOM is just a generation that I have to do. So really, I'm trying to figure out what has to be included in that SBOM to go out, right? So I have all the information. What is it that I have? And the other thing is that for open source, are you planning to have every single piece of the open source have an SBOM that comes? And am I supposed to then pull that in as opposed to using my one that went through all of the source that was in there, right? So I can scan the container and find out what's in it, right? And know exactly what's in it. And I think my customers are starting to do that too, right? So then what am I supposed to include? Is my customer going to be doing that and scanning it and then checking my SBOM to see that my SBOM complies with theirs? And is their tool going to be, is my tool the same as their tool? And is he going to find everything? Or I don't know. Those are kind of things that I think we're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it 100% compliant?
Yeah.
How do I know it's 99% trustable? Is my customer going to be doing
Yeah.
that? And all that stuff.
Yeah. Because the result you will get, it's going to be tool compliant. I mean, someone asked my colleague Georg over there once, like, so which SEA tools are you using? And his reply was, yes, all of them.
Yeah.
So,
I
yeah.
want to run with every tool.
Yeah. So I mean, we can run and I mean, benchmarks and tests has been done, and you get slightly different results, right? I mean, worst case, all of those results are wrong. Best case, at least one of them is right. But that's sort of the nature of it. So we need to define what's our comfort level with what we don't know in that. And I think you're absolutely right that in my personal view, you should be able to use your own tool, but I think it's great that it exists sort of a reference to that or a sanity check upstream in the community that's supplied by them. And I think they should be doing it perhaps not for the legislative requirements or not for what your customers want, but it's just good code sanity and checking that we haven't got other things in here that we can discover through that review process. Yeah. But,
Actually, if this open source is producing SBOMs, I can check it against what my tool is showing me and verify that I'm not missing something, that my tool is not missing, it's not broken, or that maybe the open source SBOM is not including everything.
Yeah.
It's the tool engines.
exactly. Very good points. I think we have time for like one final question. Do we? Yeah, cool. We have time for one final question.
I think the other aspect we want to talk about is how do you consume once you get it? That part has been missing in the industry. There are some what I call asset management software, right? So you can catalog and bring all that stuff. Because we went this way and we took the security aspect, not the quality aspect. So we like, oh, you give it to me. Once I have it, I don't know what to do with it. Right? So it needs to be, you plug it in your own consumption pipeline. So I'm a software developer, I build open source, bring their code, I add some my secret sauce, I deliver something. So far so good. When JP Morgan Chase buys that software from me, what do they do with that, right? Ideally, if the delivery was good, the consumption tool will be, you have a complete visibility to every single line of code that's running in JP Morgan Chase. And when a vulnerability is issued, CVE comes out, your asset inventory management system can give you a list of service applications that are exposed to. I think that would be in the future scenario where it's helping. It's all about making sure that you have a good visibility, what you're using, what you're using it for.
Yeah. And that's why it's important that we align on what data will be included here and understand that need to cater for those use cases. So in a way, it starts in that end, because I agree with you. Sometimes it's a bit like a dog chasing its tail, and it finally catches, it doesn't have any idea what will I actually do with this now that I have it. But I think we need to start from the other end, like what will we actually do when we have this, to formulate those requirements on the data so that it supports the use cases we want and how we want to ingest it, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that was, he held up a red sign. I'm done.